Okay, I'm going to turn to the Korean youth now. Travel a great deal. See the world. Don't ever be insular. Always look for many, many points of view. Retain your tradition, the best parts of it.
I would say many things actually begin with honesty.
Grow in your education. Remember that education means also challenging.
Capacity for compassion or empathy that takes you out of yourself.
I found what I'm looking for. I wanted more to see, but I'm happy with
I think I always felt that the thing I liked the most was to read and to learn and to talk and to write. So, you know, life of an academic, basically.
I'm one of the great fortunate people because I actually love getting up in the morning and doing my job. And I take satisfaction, and to me, actually, rather than I could tell you as if it's not a cliche, but I could recite to you various pleasant things that have happened, honors of one kind or another in my life. But it isn't so much that, it's doing what I want to do that seems to me my proudest achievement, actually loving the thing that I do. And that's more important than, to me at least, more important than this particular prize or that particular honor.
I think my greatest achievement will continue for many generations, and that is teaching brilliant students. And they're out there working in part on ideas that they may have gotten from me. So being a teacher is the greatest achievement somebody can have because it continues on.
What I'm proud of myself is that I still have the passion and the energy for doing active research, and I love co-authoring paper with young people, and that keeps me young. And so my greatest achievement is this ongoing love for research and interacting with students, with young people.
I'm very pleased to have had the opportunity to undertake the research and the writing that I've done. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to have such bright and interesting students in courses. It really is for others in the end to judge over time whether, you know, your accomplishment is very, very good, or that it's adequate, or however others may judge it. You try as hard as you can. You reflect on your own efforts. You find out what other people are doing.
The students I teach today will be practicing law, 50 or 60 years after I'm gone. And that's my great achievement. Lawyers tend not to be able to save lives. Doctors save lives, but when a lawyer can save a life, in my tradition there's a statement from the Talmud that says, "He who saves one human life, it's as if you've saved the whole world." And it feels that way when you save a human life.
How did you motivate yourself to study as a junior high and high school student? What sort of student were you honestly like?
I loved what I was learning. It was open-ended. Nobody told me there was a right answer that has to be discovered. I was told that I have to invent the right answers. I have to create them. I have to search after them and put them together. And so it was a challenge to my mind. And it was very important for my teachers to encourage me not to find the truth with a capital T, but the truthing process, trying to find out how to get to where it was important to get. And I think it's a never-ending process, and I've been engaged in it since I entered college in 1955, which is 51 years ago. I started this, and it hasn't ever ended, and I hope it will never end.
Wow. So I guess you didn't like high school because they were only looking for
The answers.
The answers.
The answers, and the answers were in the Bible, and the answers were in heaven, and the answers were in the books. And I'm never interested in just going through the books and finding answers. I want to use my imagination.
Elementary school and junior high, there was a lot of pressure from my parents. My mother was a teacher, school teacher, so and my grandmother too. So in my family, school was considered extremely important. So I grew up with the idea that doing well at school was absolutely essential. And then I had a couple of classmates who were very important I learned a lot from them, and then in college, when I went to college, I think they are the biggest influence on me has been my classmates, much more than my professor. My professor, well, I had some good professors and some not so good, but what I really learned from this exceptionally good group of like 50 or 60 young kids like me, they're 18, 19, 20. One thing I say always to students that start a graduate program is that you learn so much.
Not, as they say, not pressure me to do X or Y, not to become an engineer or a doctor, but that my parents took very, very seriously my schooling. And when I came home and said I got an A-, my father would say, really, why not an A? So, of course, I did grow up in exactly that circumstance.
I see a lot of similarity between Jewish family and Korean family.
No, I think there are actually some similarities. Mm-hmm. Close families, families that take education very seriously, families that live perhaps excessively with dreams for their children and what they want their children to do and achieve. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's a burden for the children. Mm-hmm. But there are similarities. Mm-hmm.
My family valued education a good deal. My parents read a lot. They didn't tell us what to study. They simply said, whatever you choose, you need to try to do your best. And they never held up some yardstick based on what everyone else was doing. But they expected us to try to do our best and to care about what we were doing. And so I grew up with that attitude. I tried to do my best at everything, and I soon discovered, as everyone does, that your best at everything is usually not the best. So you begin to discover that it's cultivating your abilities that's important. It's returning to them. It's assimilating. It's the long run of studying, not just the short run that matters. And you don't know exactly where it will lead.
Please describe some formative influences on your educational and professional development thus far. For example, like parents and friends. Who have proved to be your most abiding role models?
My mother was a very important role model for me, although she didn't go to college. The reason she didn't was not because she wasn't very smart. She was very smart. She would have been a brilliant college student. But she would have started college during the Depression. In fact, she went for 1 month during the 1929 Depression and had to leave to help support the family. And so my mother was ambitious for me and pushed me very hard and was my first defense lawyer when I got into trouble in school. My mother was always there defending me, and she taught me how to argue. And my father was a very gentle man who taught me the importance of defending the underdog and always fighting for justice. And then my teachers.
The most important influence was from your mother.
I would say so, yeah. My mother's still alive. She's 92 and a half years old and still hanging in there, still telling me what to do.
I was, looking back on it, very powerfully affected by, I had a succession of wonderful teachers, but perhaps a particularly wonderful teacher in high school who made an impression on me simply by virtue of his intelligence and intensity and sincerity. And at a certain moment, we were reading the play, and this teacher, who seemed to me fantastically intelligent and learned, looked up and said, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand this, and I simply, even now, have no idea what this means. And actually, more than many other things that he said, which were actually full of information of various kinds, that actually stayed with me quite powerfully, that he would encounter something that he didn't understand as a model of a certain kind of critical intelligence and a willingness to grapple with things that you don't completely understand.
I had a cousin who was much older than I was. He was on my father's side of the family. He couldn't walk. He was in a wheelchair. And he became a watchmaker. And I remember going to his house. It was always filled with clocks and watches. And he was very good. I mean, most people now wear, quartz watches and things, but they didn't really exist then. So he was a very good watchmaker, and he liked to hunt. This was really in deer country in Pennsylvania. So he would go out in his wheelchair and hunt from his wheelchair and sit there for hours. And of course, like any good conservationist, when he hunted and killed deer, he would eat them. They would all be dressed and put in the freezer and so forth. And I admired him because here he was a person who was disabled, couldn't walk. He developed a skill. He was very good at it. He had a terrific sense of humor. There are many people like that you meet in life. You just see they do something. There was a man when I was growing up. He was a tailor, and he used to fix clothing for my family. And he was extremely careful with what he did. I mean, he really cared about every stitch and everything he did. He wasn't happy unless something was right. Not just for his customers or his friends, but for himself. And so you meet people like that, and they leave an impression because they have a sense of an inner sense of judgment about what they're doing, which causes them not only to do it well, but it causes them to be of great service to other people in whatever it is they're doing, whether it's something like being a tailor or a watchmaker, or it can be something that is in a way more complicated, but it's the quality of doing something in a certain kind of way that is important.
I think at the very early stage, my parents, I had one professor in college who was very important in getting me to know economics the way economics is done in an Anglo-Saxon. So in Italy, there was a lot of influence from the Marxian economics and neo-Ricardian and all sorts of things which were not mainstream. And this particular professor was very good at providing me with what turned out to be quite useful. That is a way of seeing economics for what the mainstream economics is. And it was also very inspiring because he was a very successful man and his manners were quite something. And it was a good learning experience to watch him do what he was doing. Here at Harvard, my advisors have been very, very important, but more than one particular person. I think here at Harvard it was the whole environment, the idea that there is such a close community of people that are interested in knowledge and in research. I think it's the whole thing that is very inspiring. The idea that people work hard, that the most important thing that they want to achieve is doing good research. Students are really motivated. I think the whole community of learning was the one that really motivated me quite a bit when I came and even now. I mean, the idea that, you go to a seminar and there are people still discussing issues and trying to understand and debating with each other. This fire, this electricity that you smell in this place is what really motivates me.
People often define success in different ways. In your view, what is the worst way to define it? How would you define it?
Well, I think success is getting up every morning and saying, wow, I can't wait for today, living the passion of your times, and being unique, not being fungible, not being replaceable. I want people to say, I have a certain kind of problem, the only person who can solve it for me is Dershowitz. There are not 20 people out there who can solve it for me. So having a unique role, a unique place is my definition of success. Failure for me is getting up every morning and going to a job that you don't like, it being totally predictable, even if you make all the money in the world. Success for me requires the quality of life be good, the passion be maintained. Passion is not only for the bedroom. Passion must be in your daily life all the time. You must feel passionately about what you're doing. If you lose the passion, you lose the success.
Well, I mean, in my profession, I think the worst way to define success is whether you're cited a lot on the newspapers. I think in my profession, success, the best way to define success is if you make contributions that are really deep and long-lasting, and then it may be cited by the newspaper. But I think the worst way of defining success is to maximize the number of times your name appears on the Financial Times or on the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. I think the best way to define success is to really make long-lasting contributions. In general, I think the best way to define success is achieve what you really want to achieve without making compromises that you don't want to make.
Well, I think success has to come from inside. I think it has to be one's own definition of success that you have to develop. If you are always trying to live up to someone else's definition of success, first of all, it puts enormous pressure on you. And second of all, if you live up to it, but then discover that your own definition is different, then you feel you've betrayed yourself in some kind of way. Success and satisfaction are pretty closely related. I mean, if you aren't content and happy, but you're successful, I don't know whether that's a state that many people would wish to be in. If everyone in the world looked at a person and said, that person's a success, but inside that person was quite miserable or full of conflicts or anxieties or felt that they, by their own standards, were a failure, then that person would not be a success. So I think the standard measure of this is one that needs to be taken with a very large grain of salt, and that individuals have to develop an internal standard of success.
Instinctively, that the worst way of defining success is by something that has very little to do with you, but is someone else's idea of what a success is. Make so much money, or drive such and such a car, or live in this kind of house and not that kind of house. It matters whether it reaches something deep inside you, I guess. Look, I could also say grand things to save the world, but saving the world also depends upon your wanting to do it, not being obliged to do it because a abstract code has told you to. I have 3 children. One is very little, but I have 2 older children, one of whom is a lawyer, a professional litigator in New York, and the other of whom has just come back from 2 years in Africa trying to save the world. So it's not because I told one or the other to do X or Y. It's because you find things inside you to do that drive you, that you long for. But how you find these things is, everyone has his own voyage to this. It's not because I or you or anyone else tells you to do them.
What do you think the 3 most important qualities of a 21st century leader are, in academia or otherwise?
Some of them are what they've always been: hard work, just always putting your all into everything you do, and never taking shortcuts, and doing what I think Korean students excel at, and that is really, really hard work. That's number one. But number two, I think for a great leader, you have to be creative, and you have to look for new approaches. You have to be able to integrate many subjects and issues together in your mind and come to new conclusions and new solutions. And I think finally, you just have to be passionate about everything you do. And you can't just say, this is a job. This has to be the most important thing you're doing. And I really do think that Asian students in general, Korean students in particular, are going to emerge as some of the great new leaders in America, in academia, in the world.
Three most important things. I would have said a critical intelligence of a kind that, to me, seems to have been sorely lacking in our current political scene. Critical intelligence, not only a wiliness or canniness, but an ability to ask hard questions and criticize your own impulses and try to understand what the limits of your power as well as the strengths of your position are. Then I would say a breadth of experience, an ability to see beyond the very small boundaries of your own competence, so some sense of openness to a very broad world, not simply a narrow competence. And thirdly, I suppose some capacity for compassion or empathy that takes you out of yourself and your own background. That's why actually the global experiences of people like you seem to me quite important, because being able to be in one world and live in another one seems actually quite important as a human skill, especially now.
I think one of the qualities is the ability to recognize both these facts about a global situation, but also that there are very significant challenges that attach themselves to that, and that some of those challenges have to do with these completely different situations of life that people find themselves born into, basically, and that leadership needs to address those. And I think, leaders need leaders everywhere. They go back to what we were talking about earlier. They need to understand that what they are leading is other people. They're leading human beings. They are leading people who have aspirations and hopes and difficulties. And I think that they need to understand that the value of each one of those human beings is no greater or no less than any other individual human being. I do believe in that ideal of equality. And that in the end, good leadership brings along all people and not just those who are the most influential or the most powerful. There will always be people who are more influential and more powerful. I just think that's probably the human condition. But I think good leaders need to be suspicious of that. One of the reasons why the United States has certainly existed for quite a long while as a nation, but it was founded on the principle that one should be suspicious of power. Not desire it, not think it is the thing most to be sought after, but it is the thing most to be distrusted. I think good leadership needs to, yes, it has to have power, but it needs to use that power in a humane way. That doesn't mean that tough decisions can't and shouldn't be getting made. Yes, really tough decisions. And the really tough decisions are ones in which there will be some bad consequences to whatever decision you make. So we're not living in a Pollyanna-ish world here where everything's going to end up in an ideal way. But I think if you keep hold of that ideal of equality of individuals, fundamental basic human equality, it's what the whole human rights movement worldwide is basically about. That in a world which has now well more than 6 billion people and has massive communication, transportation, globalization, that that this sense of treating people with some fundamental equality is a basic important quality that many leaders will be good to think about and to reflect upon.
First one is to understand the fact that the world is changing very, very fast around us, and it will continue to do so. So it's very important that leaders understand that they need to be able to adapt their views to a world that is changing. So if I can only repeat to you how I can do things now, and I have no way how to think, then tomorrow the world changes, I don't know what to do. So leaders have to be people that know how to think in a world that is changing. I think second, they need to be courageous, because in many areas there are lots of changes that need to be made in politics and in education. So they need to be willing to make reform. Sometimes reforms need to be quick and deep and may create winner and loser, but they need to have the courage to take those kind of decision. And three, they have to be honest, because honesty is obviously critical. If you're not honest, sooner or later, you're not going to be a good leader.
Korean parents are notoriously heavy-handed when it comes to the education of their children. Have you any advice for them?
College and law school is a time to both appreciate the contribution that your parents have made to you, but also to realize that you have to live your own life, and you have to figure out how to best create a balance between parental pressures on the one hand and what you want to do for yourself on the other hand. It's probably the hardest thing that comes out. I went through that myself very much. So I came from an Orthodox Jewish background, and my parents were disappointed that I did not remain Orthodox, and they wanted to see me succeed as an Orthodox Jew. And I think my mother is still disappointed that I haven't remained within the tradition of orthodoxy. And I think inevitably we're going to see disappointed parents in the Korean community. We will see intermarriage, which every traditional community worries about. We're going to see people changing traditions, perhaps giving up on their original languages. And I think it's one of the hardest challenges that people face. I think that tradition is very important. I'm a very proud Jew. I'm very proud that my Jewishness remains very much part of my identity, but I'm also an American secularist, and I think that the great challenge for Korean students is going to be to strike that appropriate balance, not to reject tradition. It's easy if you just reject tradition and become a kind of white Anglo-Saxon Korean at Harvard. That's easy, and that's not fulfilling. And it's also very easy to simply accept the tradition completely and reject the modern, contemporary, broad culture. The hard thing is to get the most you can out of the tradition. Retain as much of it as you can, consistent with your own personal needs to change and develop.
I would say it would be hypocritical or insincere of me simply to say, lighten up, let them go, don't worry. I would say I say sympathetically to Korean parents, having had parents who are, if not heavy-handed, at least quite concerned and present and interventionist, and being such a parent myself, that it's good to be this way, but it's also, of course, good to understand that your children are not your own property. They'll do what they want to do and need to do, especially if if your relationship to them is healthy. You have to accept that they will do that. Even though I tore my hair out and grinded my teeth, you accept it. It's not just about parental obligation. I emphasize that it's about pleasure. But you have to, of course, be in the mindset to take pleasure in it. That is to say, you have to stop doing what you're doing and do the other thing, attend to your children, but not only because it's an obligation, ethical or moral or whatever, to attend to your children, but because it's actually pleasurable. It's fun. And what I would say to any parent is that if it's only gritting your teeth and doing it because you think it's important, it's probably not going to work anyway. It's not going to be good for anyone, for yourself or your children. It has to actually make sense and be enjoyable. And since learning is enjoyable, genuinely, or at least it should be enjoyable, then even things like trigonometry and algebra that I didn't come naturally to me, actually you can take pleasure in. And the things that come naturally, one can take huge pleasure in. But it has to be, I think, it has to have some delight or experience of wonder in it, for you as well as for the children.
I think my parents, in many ways, have been, too push is not the right word. They were, it's good to push your children, but my parents were a little bit too anxious. Now, when I was a kid, I didn't see that, but now I see that they were a little bit too anxious. That you can push your child, but if you should not make a tragedy whether once you get a bad grade, or to be always make your. My parents made me a little bit too scared in some ways. I mean, pushing is fine, but they made me a little bit too anxious. So I was very anxious before exams. I was extremely anxious if I wouldn't get the absolutely perfect grade. I remember having a bad, not even a bad, but not so good grade in the first year of junior high, which was the 6th grade. And my mother made such a, not as much of a scene, but she was so worried, and she was such a an event for the family that I still remember the whole day and the whole thing. So I think they made the mistake of communicating too much anxiety. So they could have pushed just as hard, but with a little bit less of a feeling of with a catastrophe incumbent on your head. So that in terms of yeah, if I had to give an advice to my parents, would be to be a little bit less anxiety producing.
So my advice to Korean parents would be to, if you want me to put it directly, I don't know that I would have put it so directly myself, but I would say be careful, because too much pressure damages. And heavy-handed, we all know that heavy-handed policies in government and heavy-handed policies in business don't usually work out well. They end up meeting resistance and producing what they're designed to prevent. Communication is so important. Young people have thoughts and feelings of their own. It's very hard often for parents to find out what they are. But you don't find out unless you ask. And you don't find out unless you ask and are willing to listen without jumping on them and immediately criticizing them. Because then if you ask again, you're not going to get any answer. Because your child doesn't want to go through that pain again. You have to have a little room there for, you wouldn't buy clothes for your child that fit just perfectly all the time. You always buy clothes that are a little too big for your child so they can grow into them. And I would say the same thing about attitudes towards education. Leave a little room to grow. Just have some freedom of choice built in. And if parents let children know that if children work hard and do their best, that matters. That matters more than being the best, in a way. Because if you work hard and do your best, then you might be the best. It's your best chance of being the best. You won't be the best in everything, but maybe you'll be awfully good in a number of things. And if Korean parents are a little heavy-handed, well, probably all parents are a little heavy-handed at one time or another, but I would say leave a little room to grow and communicate. And watch out for producing exactly what you don't want by exerting too much pressure.
Have you any advice for Korean students who aspire to join top American universities like Harvard? For Korean undergraduates who hope to attend Harvard Law School?
One of the major changes that's occurred in the 42 years I've been at Harvard is the increase in Asian students of all kinds. Asian students in the first 20 years I was teaching, there were very few. And when they came to the law school, they tended to be very polite and very quiet. It's changing now. I think we see students from all over Asia who are much more willing to be vocal, to stand up, to confront, to adapt to the kind of American way. Students are still very polite, but they can be polite and still confrontational. I remember one experience with a Korean student who had gotten all A's through high school and college, and that he was terrified if he got anything but A's, he would be a disgrace to the family. And during the course of the semester, it was becoming clear that he was not going to be an A or an A+ student, that he was going to be a good, solid student, perhaps A- or B+. He was terrified. He was very frightened about how it would appear to his parents, and I had to spend a lot of time with him, telling him that success at Harvard is not measured by grades alone, and that he would be a great lawyer, and that he should accept the possibility that he might not be a straight A student. It was a difficult conversation because he wasn't used to it. So I think that the stereotyped ambition of Korean parents, and everything is always a stereotype, it's not always true, is something that cuts both ways. First, it produces very good students and very ambitious students. But second, it can produce real tension and anxiety on the part of the students as well.
Well, my advice would be, yes, you need to work very hard. You should not set it as your only goal. Set it as a goal, but not your only goal. Occasionally, we don't ask students to master anything. We just say, well, try it, or see what you like, or, do your own thing. And that complete laissez-faire system seems to me to be rather bad. But simply listing what has to be done and putting enormous pressure on people to achieve it in a competitive way, and as it were cramming it in, and then saying, well, you have to study this because if you study that, you won't succeed, or you won't make a lot of money, or you won't have a good career. That should be something that, at least in part, the student ought to find out on their own, or they ought to discover what their own temperament and interests lead them to. Because if they don't find it out early, they will eventually find it out. But you don't want to find it out too late, when the opportunities have disappeared, or when it's very, very hard to go back and get them. People who write well and read well and have large general knowledge very often succeed in business and government in a way that people who start off studying only business and only government don't succeed, because at a certain managerial level you have to make connections and deal with different kinds of people. You have to communicate with them. You have to see a larger picture. A lot of what happens in college is making the best of the opportunities that are given to you. And any really good college or university will present to students more opportunities than they can possibly take advantage of. So, very much so, the result of that education then is what you make of it. So I would say to students anywhere, including to Korean students, yes, aspire to something, set a goal. And if it's going to Harvard, that's fine. But that can't be the only goal.
A good education is to learn how to think for yourself, to learn how to disagree with authority, is to learn how to do things differently from what it was done before. I would not worry too much about doing well in tests, because you're already very good at doing it. What I would worry more is to think a little bit more about what we were saying before, that learning things and passing tests is always only the first part of becoming a good economist. The second part is creativity and being able to produce your own ideas, and that is something that there's no book that teaches you how to do it. So my advice would be prepared for that, think about it, try to maybe take one less test in Korea and write one more paper in which you try to bring some creative idea about anything. They don't even need to be economic, whatever it is. Maybe take one fewer test and write one more essay in which you challenge the conventional wisdom on some topic. First, I would work a lot on my English. And second, take one less test and write one more essays about something which you express your own ideas and you challenge some views that some people have and try to be creative and assertive. And then third advice, when you get here, try to be really a part of the community. Don't always hang out with your Korean friends.
Not to say work 23 hours a day and so forth. I mean, love learning is important. To love learning is important.
I like the message. That's what I want.
Yeah, to love learning is important whether you go to Harvard or you go to no university at all.
Title.
But to understand that there's lots of different routes to achieve satisfaction and to achieve something important in life. Not only one route. And not only to get into the most prestigious university. If you do, that's fine. But that's not the most important thing.
If you were given 60 seconds, what would you say to Korean youth?
Okay, I'm going to turn to the Korean youth now and say, travel a great deal, see the world, don't ever be insular. Always look for many, many points of view. Retain your tradition, the best parts of it. Always think of yourself as hyphenated Americans. That's very important. You are Korean Americans or American Koreans, however you want to do it. Don't reject your tradition, but don't reject your home. Take what you will from your tradition, what is most useful to you. But don't simply say, in order to succeed, I have to give up everything from the past. Strike that appropriate balance between tradition and modernity. Continue with the best parts of your tradition: ambition, hard work, respect, but it should be respectful challenges. Students got me a wonderful t-shirt a few years ago. It said, "Challenge authority, but raise your hand first." And that's very important. You can be respectful. I'm not as respectful as I ought to be sometimes. But you can be respectful and also challenging at the same time. Always ask questions. My parents and many other parents from my tradition, when they would come home from school, they would often ask us, not did you give a good answer today, but did you ask a good question? And asking a good question, a challenging question, is often the key to success. So my goal in my lifetime is to see the first Korean American president of the United States.
I would say many things actually begin with honesty. Being honest about what you want, trying to find it out, being honest with other people in your dealings. We all have regrets, and we all have moments of remorse when we know we did things we shouldn't have done and the like. But if you are honest about that, if you don't fool yourself and are not self-deceptive, I think that is a very strong foundation for whatever it is you do. And that honesty begins in very little things, like questioning whether what you say is genuinely true, or whether it's just rumor or speculation or hearsay, whether it's what you say about friends or what you say about some sort of situation far away. That sense of respecting accuracy and truth, it's hard, but I would say that that's a very good place to begin. And also, I would say that cultivating not only your intellectual life and the life of the mind, but the life of your feelings as well. Because we very often decide things or have an attitude towards things based on our emotional life. And to pay attention to that as well as to our intellectual life, and to hope that the two are somehow integrated, somehow together in a kind of harmony. I think that that's a difficult thing to achieve, but it's important, and that begins, I think, also young. And I won't say the usual thing, which is to work hard, because you will hear that from many other people, I'm sure. But working hard doesn't mean a great deal unless you have a sense of honesty at the bottom of it, and unless somehow you are getting emotional satisfaction out of it as well.
Thank you.
I think that education is very important, and you should continue to push your children in acquiring as much education as possible. Education is particularly important this century. I think that you should be, there is an exact balance between pushing and over-pushing. Over-pushing may create then difficulties that may actually interact with the success in education. So I think that every parent should know the best way to push their children towards education. Some children need more pushing than others. For some children, what may be the exact amount of pushing for a child may be too much for another child, or vice versa. So maximizing, pushing as much as possible is not always the best strategy. There is the right amount of pushing for every child, may be different. So you want to be attentive to the kind of children that you have.
So much for your time. I appreciate it a great deal.